There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with probably the last alfresco Friday reads of 2020. I didn't think I'd get out here today, and it is a little chilly, but I have a sleepy-headed husband who can't drag himself out of bed. It's about 10 o'clock in the morning, and I thought, well, let's just go do this, and then it's done. So here I am, and quite happy to be outside. We'll see if the wind picks up. As long as the wind stays down, I think we'll be fine to get this Friday Reads filmed. So I have had an amazing reading week. I don't have a sense of it because I haven't done much prep. I have to do a little bit more prep in terms of which books to lug outside when I do this outside. But aside from that, I haven't kind of reflected on my week. But I will start on a controversial note, which seems to be the theme of my week on BookTube. 12 downvotes and counting on my last tag. I win. So my bail is controversial. I'm not making a blanket statement, but I did bail on Vanity Fair, Thackeray's Vanity Fair, because it's just horrifically racist, and I couldn't stand the racism. It's a really great novel, but it's the most racist book I think I've ever tried to read. I mean, I haven't read Mein Kampf, so I'm not saying it's as bad as Mein Kampf, but its portrayal of black people is disgusting from the first page, and I managed to put that out of my head in those opening chapters, and that started to bug me. And I wrestled with myself for half of the book thinking, if a black friend asked me, oh, Vanity Fair, is it any good? Should I read it? The first thing I would tell them is, I don't think you'd like it because the black characters are portrayed so racistly. And I thought, well, why would I recommend it to anybody then? And why am I reading it? And that's ultimately the line of thought where I just say, you know what? I don't need to read this. It's a very good novel aside from the racism, but I think aside from the racism is a phrase that I'm only speaking for myself, and lots of readers who are socially progressive and not racists themselves would draw very different conclusions, I'm sure. In fact, I know. But I couldn't stand it. The inner conversation and debate I was having ultimately drew me out of the otherwise satisfying story. But again, those words are loaded for me now when the depictions of black people were so bad, way beyond stereotypical. They were just racist. Otherwise good, aside from the racism, no. Those kind of books go in the trash. In my library, I am not talking about what you do or what the world needs to do or whether this book should be taught, but if I was a teacher, the only class I would consent to teach this in is Racist Literature 101. So there, that's my little rant on Vanity Fair. So that happened. That's my only bail. And I have finished 3 books, and I just see that despite thinking I was completely organized, that I had all the books I needed with me, I don't have one of them, and that is Helen Humphrey's book about apples, The Ghost Orchard. I finished that a few days ago. This was a buddy read with Heidi of My Reading Life, and I loved it. 5 stars. This is the kind of popular history that I am here for, and it is not academic. There were footnotes, most of which I didn't check, and I'm not going to do a full review, so I'll talk about it at some length here. She put herself into it in a way that was really satisfying for me as a reader. It started with her tasting an apple one winter's day. Now, I've actually forgotten the whole story, but I think it was at a cabin owned by her friend who had recently died in Ontario. I think that was it. It was something to do with the friend's death, but I can't remember why she was at the cabin. And it was something pearmain apple, and so she just decided to do a history of that apple and how it came to North America. And it was a very meandering narrative with lots of personal anecdote. She eventually got on to writing about the USDA, the American Department of Agriculture fruit artists. And there's some gorgeous glossy pictures in the book of those apples. Then she goes off on the tangent of writing about the lives of these apple artists. And that makes her reflect on her grandfather, who was an artist and a fairly successful commercial artist in the UK before he came to Canada. He never became pro, but he did the covers for seed catalogs or the illustrations for the seed packets. And so it kind of goes all over the place. I just really enjoyed all those dipsy doodles. I think other readers, if you like a really structured, tightly structured book, that might bug you, but I was delighted by it. It hasn't made me want to eat apples any more than I did before, which was not at all, but it was interesting. I enjoyed it. One last thing, also fascinating how indigenous peoples of North America ended up having a lot of orchards, and then the way the apple was brought over by settlers, but she explains why indigenous peoples ended up having a lot of orchards and then they got stolen. Some heartbreaking historical anecdote as well. I learned a lot about a whole bunch of things that I didn't even realize were things that needed to be learned about. Just good definition of a satisfying nonfiction November read, I would think. And I have also finished Unspeakable, the story of Junius Wilson. Okay, now the wind's coming up, so I'm hoping my mic will hold out. It's got that mic protector thing on the head, so it should be okay, but maybe I should start talking a little louder just to be safe. And this is by Susan Birch and BookTube's own Hannah Joyner of Hannah's Books. This is a buddy read with, oh my goodness, with Brian of Bookish, Roz of Scally-Dandling About the Books, Alba of Seriella, and Justin of Ghost Reader, not Ghost Orchard, Ghost Reader. And actually, I just kind of decided to finish it yesterday, so I had something to talk about today. Our last buddy read check-in isn't until this coming Sunday, but I have finished it, so I haven't checked in with the group yet, but I loved it. A 5-star read, really fascinating history. I think there will be a group video coming, so stay tuned for that. So I won't go into great detail here. It is about an African-American man in the Jim Crow South, North Carolina, I believe, but even though I've just read this book set in that state, I still permanently get North and South Carolina mixed up. One of the Carolinas, he is falsely imprisoned, and because he was deaf, but nobody really paid any attention to the fact that he had a disability, he was declared insane, and he spent more than 70 years in a mental institution before it was discovered. And because the false accusation was about a sex crime, attempted rape, he was castrated as a young man and then just held in a mental institution, and it's that story. So it was a real eye-opener about deaf history in the States, particularly among African Americans. Just fascinating amounts of detail. The evils of institutionalism, which I knew a little bit about, but this was such a vividly described history of how institutions screw up and how long it takes anything restitution-wise to occur. And the African-American history. What happened was outrageous, and it was told so well. Just an amazing book. I really, really recommend it highly. Stay tuned. I think there's a group video coming in later on. Hannah, well done. And I have also finished this Western Canadian history, Loyal Till Death, Indians in the Northwest Rebellion by Blair Stonechild and Bill Weiser. I was going to give it 3 stars, but the ending was good enough that I bumped it up to 4. So much of it is military history, and I don't think I've ever read a work of history that had so much about battles. I mean, it was an actual rebellion that maybe I wouldn't like any of them, but I found the descriptions of the rebellion itself, the military, the attacks and everything, both boring and hard to follow. Maybe the actual events were hard to follow. But now that I've read some really well done nonfiction, I realize that the quality of the writing makes a big difference, and the writing here was not great. The stuff about the politics of the indigenous peoples in what became Saskatchewan and the ramifications of this 1885 Northwest Rebellion, or I think if you are anti-colonialist, I should start saying the Northwest Resistance. I think that's what I'm going to say from now on, because they certainly had every right to resist the colonialist assholes that were starving them to death. I thought the book did a decent job of explaining how the programmatic starvation of the indigenous peoples on the reserves contributed to the resistance, but it needed to be every second sentence. The government was starving them. The government was starving them. The government was starving them. Because that's the most important thing about how all this shit happened. I'm going to put it down. It wasn't the best introduction for me. The last time I studied the Northwest resistance, the 1885 resistance, was like when I was in about grade 6. And boy, what a bunch of colonialist crap I learned then. But the main resistors were the Métis, led by Louis Riel. And the Métis were French-Canadian indigenous mixed-race peoples that to this day have a very strong cultural presence and distinguish themselves very much from indigenous people and from white people in Canada, and they have political identity and constitutional, there's a whole bunch of stuff. And I find all of that so confusing. I get corrected in the comments whenever I try to talk about the Métis, and this book didn't do anything to sort any of that out for me. The purpose of this book was to show that by and large, the indigenous peoples, the chiefs, they did not want to support Louis Riel and the Métis. They wanted to go through the political process of trying to get the asshole white Canadian government to honor the treaties that had just recently, like 8 years before, been signed, that the government was not honoring, and so the government was starving the indigenous peoples to death. And they had signed the treaties, they wanted to stay loyal to the Queen, and by and large, there were no actual chiefs, I don't think, but there were some, of the younger people in the tribes that did go over to the Métis side and actively participated. But this book goes to great pains to show that the overwhelming majority of the tribes, the indigenous peoples and their leaders on the reservations in what became Saskatchewan wasn't created until 1905, didn't want to have anything to do with the resistance, with the rebellion, and were unfairly punished in the aftermath. I mean, basically, the Canadian government just clamped down with an iron fist on all of the tribes and all of the reserves in Western Canada after this rebellion, meted out stronger punishments, and executed by hanging more of the indigenous participants and some that were falsely convicted of participating than they did of the Métis. This book convinced me that that's factually true, that the indigenous peoples weren't very involved in it, but the stance struck me as being a bit weird from the perspective of the year 2020. The resistance was justified. Riel was a bit of if I believe what I read in this book, one co-author is an indigenous historian, the other is a settler historian, that he was a messianic hothead. That's a contentious claim, although there's quite a bit of data in here. So I need to still find out more. I have the recent history. I was going to show it because I thought I'd be doing this Friday Reads in my house. I have a book, a big history of the Métis that came out last year that I'm planning to read next year. So this was a good step, but maybe a few steps ahead of what I needed to read to kind of get a handle on the history. But it certainly deepened my understanding of how horrifically racist the white Canadian government was. And why we're still in such a mess in Canada. The oppression that continues to this day, the root causes of that. And I've started 5 books, oh my God. I have started this work of nonfiction in graphic form, a work of graphic journalism, Paying the Land by Joe Sacco. I'm about 40 pages in. This is about the Dene peoples up in northern Canada, and it's about the fight for natural resources. And this author, Joe Sacco, he has done several works of graphic journalism about Palestinian, Middle Eastern issues and so on. He kind of goes all over the world, and this was quite a departure for him. So he himself is not Dene, but it's a very sympathetic portrayal of issues like fracking and traditional Dene peoples and how it is, the impact it's had on their lifestyles. I guess I'm 50 pages in. I didn't know what I would make of a nonfiction graphic book, but I finding it very solid, fascinating, and that's about all I have to say so far, but yeah, it's good. And I'm just 30 pages into this really interesting book about Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, by Richard Kapuscinski, and it's really good. So far, it's really grabbed hold of me. He was a Polish journalist. Nobody talks about him on BookTube or among the NonFiction crowd. Has anybody out there read him? It's my first by him, but I've been curious about him for a long time, and boy, he was good. In the wake of the fall of the Haile Selassie monarchy, which was the early 1970s, I think, and then it was, I don't know what kind of government. I really don't know much about Ethiopian history. I'm certainly interested. I think the government that succeeded him was pretty militaristic and dictator-ish. Not that Haile Selassie wasn't dictator-ish in his not so much constitutional monarchy as absolute monarchy. But what Kapuscinski did was he searched out the courtiers that served in the palace, that served the emperor, and he had to really search to find them because they were scared of being arrested by the new regime. But he did manage to interview them, and this book is their first-person accounts of what it was like, what they had to do, and what they observed in the dying days of the Haile Selassie era. And this guy was a kook. I don't want to offend any Rastafarians, but I don't know how you could build a religion out of worshipping this dude. Fascinating. And the way that Kapuscinski is showing him in this book through the eyes of his courtiers. One of the ones that struck me at the beginning was one courtier whose job it was to open a door when the emperor was to walk through it, and he had to practice the timing of that door opening right down to the second. And I don't think he was worried about getting his head cut off. I don't think it was that, but he was worried about losing his job, because if he opened the door as the emperor was approaching it too soon, the emperor would feel that he needed to rush. But if he opened it too late, the emperor would feel that he had to wait. And so the timing had to be absolutely precise, or maybe he would be fired, or maybe he would be sent to prison. I don't know. I didn't understand how serious it was, but it sure was serious to this particular courtier. And there's so much like that, that there's a kind of a medieval quality to the way that the emperor went about his affairs, and I'm just finding it incredibly fascinating and told in these first-person voices. So, really enjoying that. And after my bail, I've decided I could fit one more book from my NonFiction November TBR in this month. So I have started Good Night, Beloved Comrade, The Letters of Denton Welch to Eric Oliver, edited by Daniel Murtaugh. And so Denton Welch is one of my favorite writers, mid-20th century gay British writer. A biking accident when he was 18 left him in very poor health and disabled. And then he came out and wrote some of the most gorgeous fiction I've read from the mid-20th century, if not the 20th century. And very sensitive, sometimes very homoerotic fiction. And this was the relationship that he was in for the last decade, maybe, of his life, and his letters to Eric. And the introduction is so good. It's more than I ever knew about Denton Welch's life. And they started out, Denton and Eric started out not very compatible and grew more and more compatible over the years. And I think this is going to be a really touching read. So far I've just started a few of the letters, but it was the introduction that has affected me more than anything else. So glad that I have gotten to this one this year. And on the opposite end of the politically correct spectrum, I had one more book that I wanted to tackle, and I wasn't going to try it until December, but I decided to pick it up a couple days ago. I only read about 7 pages and haven't gotten back to it, so it's really going to be a book that I do read in December. Robertson Davies was one of Canada's most respected novelists. He died as a very old man, maybe 20 years ago, and he is mostly known for the Deptford trilogy, and particularly the first one in that series, Fifth Business. And I have resisted reading it or anything else by him because he was such an old poop very sexist. I don't know if I would say misogynist, but he certainly was sexist. He was a man of his era, and he loved to pronounce upon, he didn't like social changes occurring around him. I don't remember or know enough about his views on other social issues. Based on the knowledge I have now, I wouldn't call him homophobic or racist, but it also wouldn't surprise me. But he was a very physically imposing man. His head was 3 times bigger than mine, and with this shockingly white hair, and he just was about 7.5 feet tall and very courtly. I attended one reading that he and Alice Munro did, and I remember he called her Mrs. Munro. Like, he just very, yeah. Anyway, for my own political reasons, I have refused to read him, and I have been having an argument that's never gotten into anything that remotely resembled an argument, but I have been having this discussion with my dear friend and cousin Mary Jean since about 1989 or something about Robertson Davies, because she said, Sean, his books are amazing. You have to read Fifth Business. You're just going to love it. You have to. And I say, I don't want to read that old poop. And this has gone on ever since. So when Kenji pulled the books off my shelf, one of the books on there, I picked this up for like $5 at a book sale here in Tokyo. There's the price tag of the full trilogy. And this was on that shelf of books that I had to read, bail on, or otherwise deal with in 2020. This is the last one. And I said in the video, I'll put a link to that video, that I would commit to the first book only of the trilogy, which is Fifth Business. Well, I finally read it the other night. I read about 7 pages of it, and it was amazing. I got sucked into the story so deeply in 7 pages. So I immediately wrote Mary Jean an email, and I said, so how does it feel to win an argument 32 years later? I mean, I'm only 7 pages in, but I can see what all the fuss is about. What a spellbinding story already. So it opens first person with this young boy. The opening sentence is, my lifelong involvement with Mrs. Dempster began at 5:58 p.m. on the 27th of December, 1908, at which time I was 10 years and 7 months old. And this, as a 10-year-old, the protagonist was on his way home. He had to get home and be at the dinner table right at 6, and he'd been out playing with his friend, and they were having snowball fights, and his friend threw a snowball at him that missed and hit the Baptist preacher's wife, Mrs. Dempster, in the head, knocked her to the ground, and she was about 7 or 8 months pregnant, and he had to help her husband lug poor Mrs. Dempster home a block to the Baptist rectory because she couldn't walk. So he was late for dinner, and his mother went over. She was of a different faith, Methodist or something, but she was kind of midwifey, and she went over to see if Mrs. Dempster was okay, and she helped the baby to be born. And it seems like that boy, Paul Dempster, is going to be an important character in the story, but it was just such an incredible opening. So I'm not expecting anything offensive in the book. If there is, I may change my mind, because I love the opening of Vanity Fair too, except for the racism. There's no except for anything so far in this, and it's really well done. I can't wait to continue. And I have also started an audiobook, which is just amazing. I think it was Ronan Hession raving about it in a tweet, and it's a collection of Irish short stories. I believe it's a debut collection, Sweet Home by Wendy Erskine, or Erskine. She does the audiobook, and with a beautiful Irish accent, and the first story was almost an hour long, and it was so good. I'm not even going to try to describe it, because I've already been talking for more than 30 minutes, but I was blown away by the first story and look forward to continuing. All right, so I am planning to finish almost everything else that's on my plate before the end of this month. So I've got today, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, right? Monday is the last day of the month, is it not? Yes, it is. So I'm planning to finish several more books. I traditionally like to keep December. I do have a couple, maybe 3 buddy reads, which is a small number for me. But otherwise, I just want to read freely, spontaneously. So here are a couple of the buddy reads. This is an Irish novel, For the Good Times by David Keenan. And Mark, I still haven't talked to you about why you... keep mentioning Scottish dialect whenever you comment on this. Is it Irish? It's set in Ireland. It's set in the Catholic area of North Belfast, but there's some Scottish connection which I don't understand yet. But anyway, I hauled this book maybe earlier this year, and Mark said, I think it was Mark in a comment, Mark Nash and I are buddy reading this. It's our very first buddy read, and I think he suggested it, or he said he had it on his shelf and I suggested a buddy read. So finally we're going to be doing the buddy read. And David Keenan grew up in Airdrie in the late 70s, early 80s. So I'm assuming Airdrie's in Ireland? I mean, I don't really know, but this is a novel about the IRA, so I'll get it all sorted and report back, but looking forward to starting that this week. Well, this is embarrassing. I can't remember Juan's channel name, not one of just one reader, but the other Juan. What is his channel name? My God, it's gone out of my head and I can't find it written down anywhere. So, the Canary Island Juan and I will be buddy reading Jhumpa Lahiri's The Namesake in the first 2 weeks of December. Can't wait. And here are some other books. So this is the more spontaneous reading. I mean, I know that if I'm telling you a few days before, it's not totally spontaneous, but just books that I really wanted to fit in. 3 more that I really wanted to fit in. Here is a work of Zimbabwean fiction, Waiting for the Rain by Charles Mungoshi. It's published so long ago, this edition, that it was still Rhodesia. And I've had this novel on my shelf forever. It's a short little book. I haven't read nearly enough African literature this year, so here we go. And I am so excited about this one. I've been wanting to get to this all year, and so December is the time when things that don't fit a readathon or a whatever get fit in at the end of my reading year. My very first Rosamund Lehman, The Echoing Grove. So that's a fire truck, and it's finally going away from me instead of towards me. But one of the, I think, silliest things in Japan is the emergency vehicles, fire trucks, ambulances, police cars. They not only have sirens, like everybody does, but they also have a PA system where the person driving is giving verbal instructions to people to get out of the way or whatever, that are impossible to hear. I mean, I don't speak Japanese. I wouldn't be able to understand what they're saying anyway. But I mean, the siren is so deafening, and then they try to overlay that with something verbal that, I mean, people don't know what a siren means, but also you can't hear what the guy's trying to say, and it just, to me, is just overkill. But anyway, okay, finally. And while I was waiting for the siren to go away, of course it back came to me. It's Juan of Bookish Islander, of course. Jeepers, sorry, Juan. Okay, back to Rosamund. Is it Rosamund or Rosamund? Well, Roz of Scally-Daddling About the Books is Roz, so I'm going to amend that. Rosamund Lehman, The Echoing Grove. Roz of Scally-Daddling About the Books and I have a Zoom chat coming soon to a channel near you where we talk about women writers of mid-20th century. And this is one we talk about, and that kind of brought it back into my radar that I've had this book sitting on my shelf. So I am finally going to read my first Rosamund Lehman. This book was originally published in 1953, and it is about Ricky Masters, his wife Madeline, and her sister Dinah. That is certainly all I need to know, and I will report back next week. And I have been saying for months and months, if not years, that I would like to start retrying bales. So here at the very end of 2020, I am going to pick up a bale from about 3 years ago, I believe it was, certainly 2 years ago, and give it another try. And that is Gorel Gabrielson's The Looking Glass Sisters, a Pirine Press book translated from the Norwegian by John Irons, and I got not quite halfway through. I reached that halfway mark on New Year's Eve, and I remember Kenji and I were flying back to Japan, and I thought I could finish it on the airplane. But it was kind of a bleak book. There were things that I remember. I don't remember exactly what, but there were things that I was finding fault with. But it also was about a really contentious relationship between these two middle-aged sisters, and how the one sister who was disabled was being kind of pushed out by her sister's new husband and being very abused and mistreated. So it was not a happy story. I don't need a happy story. In fact, I like stories that aren't happy, but I just thought, I don't want this to be the last book I read in 2018 or whatever year it was, and so I bailed. always thinking, I'm going to come back to this one. So this is the first Bael that I have ever retried in my reading life. I'll let you know how it goes. Well, unedited, I've talked for 44 minutes, but there were a few interruptions, and here comes another siren. So it's time to quit. Thanks for watching.